Good morning, class. This is Econ 353 Macroeconomics class. Today is January 27th, Thursday. The class will move on to Chapter 4 of the textbook. The topic is the application of demand and supply. Remember that in Chapter 3, we analyzed the demand and supply and market equilibrium. In the chapter, we derived the demand curve and a supply curve based on given price. And any component of demand and supply other than price of the good will shift either demand or supply curve. So in this chapter 4, we focus on the role of the government. Sometimes governments set the price above the market equilibrium price or below the equilibrium price in order to correct any distortion caused by the market. So minimum wage law is one of the examples that set the price above the equilibrium price. And also price ceiling is the case that's set by the local government about the apartment rent in the big cities. So we will discuss this, the role of a government in the market equilibrium.
Let's look again at the effect of a price control on a market. We'll start with a classic example, the market for rental housing in a city where there's a rent control. If we had a free market for apartment space, we would have people supplying apartments, more apartments being supplied as the price rises, and people demanding apartment space. The demand curve sloping downward, meaning fewer people are willing and able to buy apartments or rent them as the rental price of apartments goes higher and higher. Suppose that a city votes to try to protect its low-income members by imposing a ceiling on the rental price of an apartment. We call this a rent control. So we put in a rent control at this level. This is a restriction, and I'll put a bar over the top of it to represent the price control. It can go no higher than this regulated level. If the equilibrium price of an apartment is $1,000 a month, the city may decide that that's too high and control the price to be $500 a month and no more. If that's the case, what will happen? Well, one thing that could happen is that landlords and tenants simply avoid the rent control and find sneaky ways to get around it. The landlord might charge you $500 to rent an apartment, but also charge you another $500 to rent the key or the air conditioner or the rugs. In that case, you're really paying $1,000 a month for the apartment, and we go right back to our free market equilibrium. That's the case where the rent control is ineffective and avoided. The second case would be where the rent control is actually strictly enforced, and the landlord cannot get more than $500 for each apartment from a tenant. If that's the case, the situation actually becomes very costly. The first thing that happens, as usual with a price restriction, is that all of these landlords whose opportunity cost is greater than $500 a month will simply withdraw their apartments from the market. And the total quantity of apartments rented will drop from this amount right here with a free market to this smaller quantity of apartment space. And we might call this Q bar. the restricted quantity of apartment space that's available in the presence of the rent control. Well, what that tells you right off the bat is there's going to be some kind of deadweight loss. We've got a restriction in trade, and since the original situation was good in some sense, this restriction of trade cannot be an improvement. The second problem is, of course, the problem of rent seeking. Who all wants an apartment at a price of $500 a month? Why, look, all of these people, all the way out the demand curve here, we've got a huge excess demand for apartment space. What usually happens when we have an excess demand? Usually what happens is the bidding mechanism pushes up the price of apartments until we return to equilibrium. In this case, however, the bidding mechanism has been blocked by the price control. Therefore, all of these people who want to rent an apartment for $500 a month will find themselves engaging in non-price competition. Now, what does non-price competition mean in this market? It means trying to get to apartments ahead of other people. It means reading the obituaries in the morning to find out what apartments may have opened up overnight. It also means hiring kamikaze apartment locators. This is locators with very sharp elbows who have a talent for getting to the front of the line for you. That is, taking apartments away from other people to make sure that you get them. Who can afford a kamikaze locator? Well, as these people, all of these potential tenants begin to compete with each other to hire kamikaze locators, the price of locators will be bid up until the true cost of getting an apartment is equal to P prime. P prime is a higher price, perhaps $1,300 a month. $1,300 a month includes the $500 rent, plus an additional $800 that you have to pay to a locator to guarantee that you get the apartment. This is $800 a month, which you might think of as a payment that you owe your locator for having done this service for you. Well, here's the new equilibrium. Tenants pay $1,300 a month, $500 of it to landlords, and $800 of it to apartment locators. And we have a huge deadweight loss. All of this area here represents economic value that's been destroyed by the price control. The price control restricts trade as apartments leave the market because landlords can't cover their opportunity cost. And all of these tenants who can't afford to keep up with the competition are priced out of the market. All of these trades are blocked by the price control. On top of that, you have all of these tenants who are paying money to these kamikaze locators. Now, these are not your usual locators who just happen to have good information about where apartments are. These are people that you hire to go out and wrestle for you, people that you hire to go out and take apartments away from other competitors. They're not really adding any value to society. They're your own hired army that you hire to try to get a bigger share of the benefit for yourself. They're not creating value for society. In fact, they cost society value. Because instead of going out and wrestling for apartments, they could be hooking rugs, writing children's books, assembling computer boards, or doing other things that create value. As they take their time away from value-creating activities and direct it instead into rent-seeking activities, it becomes costly for society. And the amount of the cost is approximated by this area here. That is the amount of money they get paid to attract them away from other valuable activities. If you add up the amount of rent-seeking activity and the amount of deadweight loss, you can see that the price control is very costly to society. All that's left in this market, instead of the big consumer surplus and producer surplus that we had before the price control, is a small amount of consumer surplus up here and a small amount of producer surplus down below. The price control has messed up this market through a deadweight loss and the cost of rent-seeking activities. That's the story about a price control in the market for rental housing. The same story applies if we think about the market for tickets to concerts. You have a demand curve for concert tickets, a supply curve for concerts, And you have a price control, often that's imposed by the act itself, a band that wants to make sure that people get to come and watch it in concert. If there's a price control on the tickets, we wind up with a similar situation. Tickets are sold at a price below the true equilibrium price. As a result, it may be that fewer concerts are produced. Producers of this act or of similar acts may decide that they can't cover their opportunity cost of bringing more art for people to see. Meanwhile, there are a lot of people who would like to see the concert but can't afford it because the price of tickets has been bid up. Once we have a restricted quantity of tickets, people will resort to non-price competition. And you know what that means: standing in line or buying tickets from scalpers. This box right here represents the rent-seeking activity, the cost to society of having people who could be writing children's books standing on a street corner scalping tickets, or the wasted time of people standing in line when they could be doing something productive. Now you might argue, what if I like to stand in line? Well, if you like to stand in line, you can stand in line. But the point is, you shouldn't be forced to stand in line to allocate tickets. It's cheaper for society if people allocate tickets through the price mechanism. If we want to help people who can't afford tickets get tickets, perhaps we should give them a subsidy or increase their income. But using a price control does not help people in this model who have low incomes. It doesn't help the people who can't afford to pay as much for tickets. In fact, the people who wind up getting the tickets are the people who can afford not only the old equilibrium price, but the higher price that scalpers will charge in this event. The Economist ends this story by saying that price controls rarely achieve their goal. Because price controls often create a situation of shortage, and on top of that, the pressure of non-price competition and the waste associated with it, price controls usually create a bigger mess than the problem they were intended to solve. Suppose you were concerned about the plight of low-wage workers in the economy. You want to make sure that people who are working hard make enough money to take care of their basic needs or feed their family. And therefore, you are led to support a minimum wage. Now, frequently in economics, we study unanticipated consequences of economic policy. That is, we enact a policy for one reason, but the policy has unanticipated consequences that may actually work against the policy's intention. Economists like to make this argument about the minimum wage, that in fact minimum wage laws may, in many cases, hurt the very people that they are designed to help. Now, there's a lot of controversy these days about the minimum wage, whether it actually, on net, helps or hurts low-wage workers. But what we'll do in this lecture is look at the standard economic argument using supply and demand analysis for why the minimum wage has unanticipated consequences that may in fact harm low-wage workers. We're going to look at this story in our supply and demand diagram that we're so familiar with. I want to make sure that we're clear on what all of the curves represent. Let's suppose now that we have price and quantity, and since this is the market for labor, the price will be the wage. This will be the hourly wage, or the amount of money that must be paid per hour for labor services. On the horizontal axis, we'll have the quantity of labor, and this will be the quantity supplied by workers or demanded by employers. Now, putting these two together, we create a graph in which we can represent the market for labor. Let's begin with the demand curve for labor. The demand curve for labor is downward sloping, representing the fact that as labor gets less expensive, firms will hire more workers. Firms will hire more workers for two reasons. The first is, as the wage falls, the cost of doing business is declining, and therefore the business may be inclined to expand its operations. Remember, when costs fall at the margin, businesses find it profitable to produce more of their output for sale on the market. So as the wage falls, the business may actually be expanding and hiring more workers. A second reason why lower wages lead to an increased quantity of labor demanded is the substitution between labor and other factors of production. That is, when labor gets less expensive, employers are inclined to use more labor and less capital to produce a given quantity of output. So lower wages result in a substitution in the direction of labor, the less expensive or the output that is declining in relative price. So for two reasons, the costs of doing business are lower and labor is now relatively less expensive, lead to an increased quantity of labor demanded as the hourly wage falls. Let's look now at the other side of the market, that is the supply curve for labor. And the supply curve for labor is a controversial graph. How do we know how workers are going to respond when the wage goes up? There are two things that workers might do. As the wage increases, we might expect, first of all, what we call in economics a substitution effect. That is, with higher wages now, workers are inclined to work more hours because the cost of leisure has increased. That is, if I have to choose between spending an hour sitting in the park reading a book and an hour working at the factory, well, I'm going to be considering the quantity of goods and services that I could purchase with the wage that I earn from that hour's worth of work. If the wage goes up now, then I'm giving up more goods and services to enjoy the hour sitting in the park. The cost of leisure to me, the opportunity cost of leisure is rising. Therefore, I'm inclined to consume less leisure and enjoy more of the goods and services that I can purchase from that hour of work in the factory. Therefore, the substitution effect leads workers to work more hours when the hourly wage increases. On the other side of the argument, there is what we call the income effect. The income effect is the effect on the worker's behavior when the worker becomes richer. After all, if the wage rises, then you can now afford to pay your bills by working fewer hours. If I have to pay $500 worth of bills every week, then if I can earn $500 from 20 hours worth of work instead of 40, then I'll work my 20 hours and spend the rest of the time having fun. That's because at a higher wage, I'm now wealthier, I'm now richer for a given amount of work, and I'm inclined to purchase more leisure. That is, as my wealth increases, as my income rises, as I get richer, I'm going to want more of all goods, including leisure, and therefore I will cut back my hours at work. Ask yourself this question. What would you do if your boss at work doubled your wage? Would you work more hours or fewer hours? Well, it depends on whether the substitution effect is stronger for you or whether the income effect is stronger for you. If the income effect is stronger, then you would cut back your hours and enjoy more leisure or study time. If the substitution effect is stronger, you would work longer hours so that you can afford to buy more toys and goods and services and other things that you enjoy that money can buy. So, the effect of a higher wage on household behavior is ambiguous. It depends on whether the substitution effect is stronger or whether the income effect is stronger. But for the sake of our argument, we're going to draw the supply curve for labor as if it is upward sloping. That is, I'm going to draw this picture as if the substitution effect were stronger. That is, as if higher wages lead workers to work longer hours. So here I go. I'll make sure this line is real clear. There's my substitution effect dominating. There's my supply curve for labor. So the demand curve represents the behavior of firms. They demand a larger quantity of labor when the wage falls, and the supply curve represents the behavior of households. They supply more labor hours as the wage rises. Suppose we have an unregulated market. In a free market, equilibrium would be established where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. That is, at the intersection of the blue and the red curves. If we drop our line down here, we'll see this is the quantity of labor that would be supplied and demanded in the labor market at equilibrium, and the wage at which the market clears would be W star. So this might be something like $5 an hour, and this might be 100 hours a week in a particular labor market. Well, suppose we decide as a society that $5 an hour is too little for a worker to be paid, that in order to make a living wage, workers have to earn at least $6 an hour. And we calculate that through studies and logical reasoning and looking at the prices of food and housing and medical care. And we want to establish then a minimum wage that's higher than the equilibrium wage. Now, the minimum wage is a floor below which the wage is not legally permitted to fall. That is, if a minimum wage is established, then all businesses have to pay a wage that is at least as great as the minimum wage. So we'll put the minimum wage up here. We'll call this W sub M for minimum wage. And it's important that the minimum wage is above the equilibrium. After all, if it's below the equilibrium, then it's irrelevant, because market forces are going to bid the wage up to at least $5 an hour. It's only if your minimum wage is greater than $5 an hour that it makes any sense at all. So suppose now that we have legislated a minimum wage. That is, all workers can expect to receive this wage if they have a job, and all employers are required by law to pay it. What would the consequence of a minimum wage be? Well, if we follow the minimum wage over to check on the behavior of the players in this competitive market, we see, first of all, that the prospect of earning $6 an hour draws a lot more households into the labor market. The quantity of labor supplied increases with the minimum wage. That is, the amount of labor that households want to supply at this higher wage is greater than it was before. So we'll call this QS sub M. That's the quantity of labor supplied under a minimum wage. On the other hand, firms are less interested in hiring workers when they have to pay this higher wage. Therefore, the quantity of labor demanded is reduced. And it's reduced for two reasons in this story. The same two reasons that the demand curve for labor is downward sloping. The first is that the minimum wage raises the overall cost to the firm of doing business, and therefore inclines the firm to cut back its output. Therefore, it needs fewer workers. The second problem for the workers is that the higher wage leads firms to substitute away from labor in the direction of capital or other factors of production. With the higher wage and less labor being demanded, a smaller quantity of labor demanded, then we have QDM, the quantity of labor demanded under the minimum wage, being less than the quantity supplied. Here's the unintended consequence. With the minimum wage above the equilibrium, the quantity of labor supplied exceeds the quantity of labor demanded. We have, therefore, an excess supply of labor, and that has a special name. We call that unemployment. There are a lot of people who want jobs at the minimum wage who are not going to have the opportunity to get them because firms won't hire the workers. That is, the quantity of labor supplied exceeds the quantity of labor demanded, and the distance between these 2 points constitutes unemployment. Workers who are willing and able to work at the going wage but cannot find jobs because the firms are not hiring. This is the unintended consequence. Well, what's going to happen then? Who's going to actually get these jobs? If there are only 50 jobs being offered but 150 applicants, how are we going to sort out which workers actually get them? Well, all kinds of things could happen. First of all, notice that we've got 50 workers who are willing to work for a much lower wage down here. If we look at the actual supply curve, we can get 50 workers for a wage down here of maybe $3 an hour. Now, legally, we have to pay those workers $6 an hour, but we could ask those workers to do other things. We could make sure that they wash their uniforms themselves. We could make sure that they get transportation to and from work, perhaps riding with their parents or other workers or whatever. So ultimately, firms might be able to pass costs on to workers that lower their effective return from the job down to something like $3. These workers wouldn't apply in those circumstances because they couldn't make enough money to cover their opportunity cost. They'd rather work at home or be out of the labor force, perhaps taking care of children or some kind of self-employment. But these workers down here would work for the equivalent of $3 an hour. And therefore, even though they're being paid $6 an hour, the firm is able to impose extra duties on them that reduce their effective pay down to $3 an hour. The economist has been concerned because, look, all of these jobs that should be created where the benefit to firms is greater than the cost to the workers, all of these jobs are shut down by the minimum wage. The price regulation creates a deadweight loss and a kind of non-price competition. Those workers who are willing to stand in line the longest, wash their uniforms the cleanest, make sure they get transportation to work, or any other arbitrary conditions that the employer might like to impose, they're the ones who get the jobs, and their effective return is lower than the minimum wage. So, to summarize, the minimum wage was adopted in order to help low-income workers or low-wage workers. But, in fact, there are two unintended consequences that work against the very people that the policy is designed to help. The first is that with a minimum wage, employers may reduce their demand for labor. And when the quantity demanded of labor falls, unemployment is created as there is an excess supply. The workers want to work at the higher wage, but the jobs aren't available. The second consequence is that there may be some kind of non-price competition, employers imposing extra burden on workers so as to lower their effective wage down to somewhere even below the equilibrium wage that we started with, due to extra duties like cleaning uniforms or providing transportation or other things. So, in summary, the minimum wage is an example that economists like to use to show how policies that are well-meaning may actually have unintended consequences that actually hurt the very people they are designed to help. So why then are labor unions often in favor of minimum wages? We'll see this in the next unit when we consider the relationship between wages and productivity. We're still talking about taxes. Now the question is, how does an excise tax affect the market equilibrium? We're going to use a supply and a demand diagram to show how the existence of an excise tax influences the price and quantity traded, and how it affects the amount of economic value that's created in a market. We start with our usual demand curve and supply curve. Now, if we had a free market, a market that had no interference, no taxes in it, the equilibrium would be where the curves cross. The equilibrium price would be here, and the equilibrium quantity would be right here. However, if we introduce an excise tax, that's going to mess things up a bit. You can show the excise tax in this diagram in either of three ways. Let me go through those three ways in turn. The first way that you can represent an excise tax is you can think of it as an additional cost that the sellers have to bear. If the seller has to pay the excise tax, say the baker has to give the government $2 for every loaf of bread that he sells, then that's like an extra cost. It increases his opportunity cost of providing the bread for sale. So for every loaf of bread, we have to go through and add on $2 to the opportunity cost of providing it. What that's going to do is it's going to shift up the supply curve. It's going to shift up the cost curve, the opportunity cost curve, by the amount of the excise tax. So I could do that like this. It's a parallel shift. The whole curve moves upwards by $2 at every point to represent the excise tax as an extra cost. In that case, the new equilibrium is going to be where this curve, the tax-distorted curve, or the supply curve plus tax, crosses the demand curve. The equilibrium price will be here. The equilibrium quantity will be down below. And the difference between these two curves is the difference between the price that buyers pay and the price that the seller gets to keep after the tax. So we can show the excise tax as a shift in the supply curve. That is, we can think about it as an extra cost for sellers. The second way that we could represent the excise tax is we could show it as a cost that's imposed on buyers. Suppose buyers have to pay the excise tax. That is, suppose when you go in to buy a loaf of bread, you have to report it to the government and pay $2 to the government for every loaf of bread you buy from the baker. In that case, what happens is that the buyer lowers the price that he's willing to pay the baker. If the loaf of bread is worth $4 to you, and you've got to give $2 to the government every time you buy a loaf of bread, then you're only willing to give $2 to the baker himself. The government got $2 of your $4 reservation price. So we can think of this excise tax as a cost that's imposed on the buyers of bread. And we could show that by moving the demand curve downward by $2 at every point. By moving it downward, we're saying that the buyer is only willing to give the baker an amount that's $2 less than what he's willing to pay, because the government is going to take $2 of his price. So we could show it this way. The demand curve shifts downwards by $2 to give us what we might call a tax-distorted demand curve, or the demand curve minus the tax. This is what the buyer is willing to pay to the seller. In this case, our equilibrium price would be here at the intersection, and the equilibrium quantity traded would be here. Notice that this tells us the price that the seller actually gets to keep when the buyer comes in to buy the bread. The buyer, however, is paying $2 more for the bread. It just so happens that $2 is going to the government. Now, before I show you the third way, let me point out something interesting about these first two ways of representing an excise tax, and that is they're completely equivalent. It doesn't matter whether you shift the demand curve downwards by $2 at every point, or whether you shift the supply curve upwards by $2 at every point. From the point of view of geometry, they're exactly the same thing. It doesn't matter whether you're moving this curve downward or this curve upward. You're still going to have the same point of intersection. You're going to have the same quantity traded, and you're going to have the same price paid by the buyer and received by the seller. We call this result the irrelevance of the legal incidence of a tax. What that fancy phrase means is this. It doesn't matter whether legally the tax is imposed on the sellers so that it shifts the supply curve upwards, or whether the tax is legally imposed on the buyers so that it shifts the demand curve downwards. It doesn't matter who legally is responsible for paying the tax. In the end, the equilibrium price, quantity, and division of economic value are going to be the same, no matter who legally pays the tax. So, since it doesn't matter whether we shift the supply curve upwards or the demand curve downwards, there's a third way that we can show the tax that works in any case. That is, that points out and reminds us that the legal incidence is irrelevant. And that is, we can think about this tax as a wedge. It's a wedge that has to fit between these two curves. The only trades that can take place in this market, the only trades that can take place in this particular market for bread are those trades where the buyers are willing to pay enough so that after the tax is subtracted, the sellers can cover their opportunity cost. What I do then is I look for the place where the tax wedge just fits between the demand curve and the supply curve, and that is going to be my equilibrium. That is the end of trades that can take place when the excise tax is imposed. So I'll slide my wedge right here until it just fits between the two curves. And I'll put a dot here and a dot here to represent the equilibrium. In equilibrium, with this tax wedge, what we have is buyers paying this high price here. We'll call this the demand price. Sellers receiving this lower price, P sub S, we'll call this the seller's price. And the gap, or the difference between the two, is going to be the tax wedge, or the amount of money that's raised in taxes. The equilibrium quantity traded with the tax, we'll call this Q sub T, is the quantity that just leaves room for the tax wedge to fit between the buyer's price and the seller's price. Now, that's the same thing. The equilibrium that I've calculated here is exactly the same thing as if I had shifted the demand curve downwards by the $2 tax. My intersection would be at this point. The sellers would get this price, the buyers would be paying this price plus the $2 tax, and the quantity traded would be at this point on the axis. This equilibrium is also the same thing as if I had shifted the supply curve upwards by $2. In that case, we'd get this as our equilibrium price, what the buyers have to pay. But what the sellers get to keep is $2 less, because they are responsible for the tax. So, to summarize, there are three ways that you can represent an excise tax in a supply and demand diagram. You can shift the supply curve upwards and think of it as an extra cost for sellers. You can shift the demand curve downwards and think of it as a cost that's imposed on the buyers if the buyers have to pay the tax. Or you can simply think of it as a wedge that's imposed between the buyers and the sellers that separates them so that the price that the buyers pay is greater than the price that the sellers get to keep. And the difference between those two prices is the amount of the excise tax. Notice, however, no matter which of the three methods you use, you're going to get the same outcome, the same quantity traded, the same price that buyers pay, and the same price that sellers receive. Consider the peculiar characteristics of a market where the demand is price inelastic. We've already seen that when the demand is price inelastic, there is a direct relationship between the price of the good and the total revenue that is earned in that market. Consider, however, in addition to this inelastic demand, that supply is highly variable. That is, the supply curve shifts around a lot, say in response to changes in the weather. When you've got inelastic demand plus shifts in the supply curve, you wind up with a situation where total revenue itself becomes highly variable. And this can become a problem, particularly if you're a farmer. Most agricultural products have price inelastic demand. That is, people are going to buy their food products whether they're expensive or whether they're cheap. You don't really have much choice. So if we take an agricultural market, this is the situation that characterizes it. What's more, not only is the demand for food price inelastic, it's also income inelastic as well. When you get richer, you don't tend to spend a lot more money on food. You'll spend your money on vacations or health care or automobiles or something else instead. So things that shift the supply curve, say changes in productivity, technological advance, other stuff like that, that tend to make people wealthier, don't have a big effect on the demand curve for food. So shifts in the supply curve then cause the price of agricultural products to vary quite a bit. And with this variability in price comes variability in total revenue, and that means variability in the income of farmers. From the point of view of a farmer, this is a problem, and it's a cause for government intervention. We've had agricultural markets forever, and back well before there were well-functioning insurance markets, farmers faced this problem of price and income variability. So they encouraged governments to step in and implement policies that would stabilize income, or failing that, at least stabilize the price of their products. We have now in the United States a vast array of agricultural policies designed to deal with this problem. And that's why economists like to talk about agricultural markets when it comes to a discussion of government interference in the market, its causes and its consequences, both intended and unintended. So let's look now at how an agricultural market works and how particular government policies may end up actually making the situation worse. Consider, first of all, the demand for corn. When the price is high, the total revenue is going to be price times quantity, the area of this green box. If the price is low, on the other hand, we get a smaller total revenue, the area of the purple box. Because demand is inelastic, price and total revenue will move in the same direction. Now let's consider what's happening in the market that causes the price to change. That's going to be caused by shifts in the supply curve. Farmers are going to make their plans based on some average supply curve, where the market would presumably, through the bidding mechanism, give us some average price and some average quantity. But the average thing almost never happens. You can have a bad year. A bad year means a year where weather is unfavorable, floods and droughts, which shifts in the supply curve. At any given price, you get less corn than the farmers expected to get. The odd and paradoxical thing is that a year that's bad for weather is actually a year that's good for total revenue. When farmers have a bad year, they actually end up making more money. It's almost like a monopolist that restricts the quantity so as to jack up the price. Well, competitive farmers can't collude like that, but if the weather forces a scarcity on them, it becomes an occasion for the bidding mechanism to provide a higher price and a bigger total revenue. On the other hand, if the farmers have what we might call a good year, the supply curve shifts outwards. That is, a bumper crop, favorable weather, lots of corn, the market is flooded with food. However, this is bad for farmers because the lower price winds up giving us a smaller total revenue in this market where the demand is inelastic. So the first paradox about agricultural markets is that a good year is bad for farmers and a bad year is good for farmers if farmers are really concerned about their total revenue or their earnings. So what can we do about a situation like this? What can we do about a situation where shifts in the supply curve create price instability, and price instability creates instability in total revenue? Well, one thing that we could try to do is to stabilize the price. Suppose we decided that the price is going to be stabilized at some notion of average price of corn. That is, let's draw in here a supply curve that represents the average of the good years and the bad years. And let's look at what the price would be in a case that we had this outcome. So supply and demand crossing at this point gives us this, and we'll call this P star, which represents our average price. And I won't clutter the diagram by putting in the average quantity, but it's certainly going to be down here on the horizontal axis. Well, of course, no year is truly average. So what's going to happen is that in a bad year, a year with bad weather, when the supply curve would shift inwards, so we have here a supply in the bad year, so I'll call this bad. We have a higher equilibrium price, but if the government is going to support the price, that is, keep the price at P star, what's going to happen in these years is we've got an excess demand. That is, farmers are only supplying this small quantity down here, but people who want cornflakes and cornmeal and the agricultural product are going to want this larger quantity at the supported price. So the government has to stand ready to provide enough corn to make up for the excess demand. Where's the government going to get the corn that it sells to keep the price constant? It's going to get it by buying corn in years of bumper crops. So in the years of the bumper crop, here is our supply curve in a good year. If the government keeps the price at P star, then the farmers are going to find that they're not able to sell corn at P star to all the people that they have corn for. In fact, the quantity supplied is going to be much larger than the quantity demanded. We have an excess supply of corn at a price of P star. So the government takes that excess supply, fills up its barns and silos, and stands ready to pay farmers this price, P star, which farmers can now count on. So we've stabilized the price of corn. Farmers know what they can count on. And unfortunately, we've got barns full of corn in some years and the government involved in distributing corn in other years. How did the government get in the food distribution business, you might ask? Well, on top of that, we've got another problem, which is P star is a policy variable. And there's going to be disagreement about exactly where this average supply curve is. And in time, the farmers' lobby is going to work to push P star up because that adds to their profits, which means that on average, there are going to be more years where the government has to buy corn than there are going to be years where the government sells corn. In time, the government is going to accumulate surpluses chronically. Now we got a bunch of corn sitting around and we don't know what to do with it. We could give it away in the United States, but that would push down the price of corn and complicate our farmers' problem. What we do then is we export it. We send it to some other market, like Africa, and we can even send it there as food relief. That sounds great and humanitarian until you consider the fact that all of this free food flooding into Africa distorts incentives in those agricultural markets. Farmers counting on free food from the U.S. and Europe aren't inclined to plant food themselves because they know they can't make a profit for it because the price is going to be low because of all of this free food aid. And then anytime the free food aid is disrupted, there isn't food there to feed the local population and famines can result. So our attempts to get rid of these chronic surpluses by dumping them in other markets creates problems for other countries, countries where the needs may be more desperate. All right, so let's suppose then we don't go with a flat-out price support, a guaranteed price for farmers, but instead we try to restrict the quantity supplied so as to keep the price higher. How can we restrict supply when we've got thousands and thousands of competitive farmers out there, each trying to make a profit by selling more food? It's kind of like the problem OPEC has of controlling oil producers. Well, one possibility would be set-aside programs where we tell farmers you can only plant corn on so many acres, and the farmers agree that this is a condition of their support from the government that they have to go along. Well, if they do, they're just going to take their least productive land out of agriculture and hyper-cultivate the most productive land. That is, they're going to use a lot more labor, a lot more fertilizer to try to grow more corn on limited parcels of ground. Well, this just raises the cost of producing any given quantity of corn because we're forcing farmers to substitute away from land and instead to use more expensive labor and fertilizer that they wouldn't use if it weren't for this government policy. So set-aside programs introduce another distortion, which is inefficient techniques of production. Another possibility besides set-aside programs are marketing arrangements, where farmers agree only to bring so much corn to market each year. That is, they agree to collude and shift the supply curve in so as to keep prices up. Well, these agreements are subject to all kinds of cheating. People are going to look for other ways of selling their products on the side, so they're kind of hard to enforce. But even if they were perfectly enforced, that means there's going to be a lot of waste, because if the amount that farmers are allowed to sell is limited to this amount right here, QH, which gives us the high price, then in a year of a bumper crop, we've got a lot of oranges and corn and other stuff that we just simply have to destroy, because otherwise it would be floating around in the market depressing the price. So these marketing agreements can be very wasteful, unless farmers want to get into the business of storing their products, which may or may not be feasible. A final way of dealing with the problem that farmers face is to directly support their incomes. And this is what the economist would say to begin with. The problem is farmers' incomes are too variable. If we want to help the farmers, then let's stabilize their incomes. Well, the economist's first solution would be to have these farmers buy insurance. The insurance market could solve this problem. But short of that solution, if the government is going to provide some kind of insurance substitute, then it should give farmers money to supplement their incomes in years when prices are low, and tax the farmers to cover the cost of this program in years where prices are unexpectedly high. And this is the basic idea behind the Federal Agricultural Improvement and Reform Act of 1996. This act is designed to get the government out of the business of price supports and running storage programs, and instead provide income for farmers to help them stabilize the difference between years when output is low and prices are high and farmer incomes are typically good, and years when bumper crops push prices down and provide farmers with less income. So although we can be critical of the act, I mean, there are some provisions that economists would say are not promoting efficiency. It is a step in the right direction by giving the government out of the business of tinkering with prices and putting it in the business of redistribution of wealth, which is something that the government can do in a society where we want to protect the incomes of people who are otherwise at the mercy of the weather. So agricultural markets are a great example of the government interfering to try to make the world work better. But as is usually the case, there are unintended consequences of each of these government policies, and the unintended consequences, in many cases, wind up creating more problems than the problems they were originally designed to solve. The moral of the story is, if you've got a distortion in the market, try to find the policy that's crafted so as to directly address that distortion without introducing new ones.
So, hello class. So today, after we learned about demand and supply, what we're going to do is we're going to put the demand and supply curves together. So the demand curve is that of the latte, and the supply curve is that of latte 2. So we're going to see how, when you put demand and supply together, what happens to the market. So once we look at this, we find that, okay, P has reached equilibrium level when quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So here's a new definition for you. Equilibrium is when P is the price. It is the point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So if you look at, let's say, any other point, so let's say we're looking at this point, at $5, quantity demanded is somewhere here, quantity supplied is somewhere here. So they're not equal, so this price, $5, is not the equilibrium. If we are down here, quantity supplied is somewhere here, quantity demanded is somewhere here, and they're not equal too, so this is not at the equilibrium. So the only place where we have equilibrium is at $3. At $3, the demand curve and the supply curve intersect, and that's the point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And it's at $15, or 15 units and $3. Surplus or excess supply is when quantity supplied is more than quantity demanded. So let's say at $5, when price is $5, quantity demanded of lattes is 9 lattes. So if the seller is charging $5 in the market, only 9 people will come and get lattes from the seller. On the other hand, since the seller is expecting $5, the seller has produced a lot more lattes because according to the law of supply, as prices are higher, sellers want to sell more. And quantity supplied is 25. So in this case, there is a surplus because the seller is waiting to sell 25 units of latte, but only 9 people came and purchased it. So there is an excess of 16 lattes. So in this case, whenever a seller has excess products and wants to get rid of it, well, one thing they can do is just throw it away, but that's just throwing away money. The other thing is they just sell it at a lower price. So when they do that, the sellers try to increase sales by cutting price. So how do they do that? Okay, well, they lower price to $4. So when they lower the price to $4, now, because of law of demand says as price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Now, quantity demanded has risen slightly. And since prices are lower now, quantity supplied is falling. And the same thing keeps on going, but still we have a surplus. The surplus is smaller, but we still have a surplus. So there is still excess amounts just laying around. So in this case, the supplier keeps on reducing prices until the market reaches this equilibrium. So this is where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. The seller brings in exactly 15 units of worth of raw materials to make coffee, makes the coffee, sells them at $3, and the buyers buy exactly 15 units of latte. And so the market is efficient in this case. There is no excess. Now, what if there is excess demand? That is, there is more being demanded than what is being supplied. So supposing the sellers think that, no one wants to drink coffee or latte here. People drink tea here, so we're going to charge $1. But at $1, there's a lot more people who want to buy lattes. Let's say 21 lattes. But the sellers have, since price is so low, the sellers have enough to supply to only 5 of them. So that means that there is a shortage of 16 units because there's more people wanting to buy it, not that many willing to sell it. So there's a lot of people waiting in line to purchase it. So that's when you see long queues. This is when this scenario is very visible during Black Friday. You have people waiting in line for hours upon hours waiting for the store to open because prices are so low. People want to wait in line to get it. And so there's always this jostle to get the first, your hand in the first product that you see. So whenever this is the case, if there's a shortage, sellers can raise their price, which causes quantity demanded to fall because as price goes up, quantity demanded will fall, but quantity supplied will rise. And this keeps on going because there is still a shortage, so this keeps on going until the price reaches the equilibrium. And that's where the market clears. So now we know that Y is $3, the market clearing price, or the equilibrium price. It has a lot of names: market clearing price, equilibrium price, or just the price. It is the place where there is no excess or there is no shortage. The market clears and everything is good. Now, here are certain things that we want to also make sure we understand. When we say there's a change in supply, it means that the supply curve has actually shifted its position. And we're going to see an example afterwards. And this happens when a non-determinant of supply changes. So one of those things that we listed, like technology, input costs, and all those things, when they change, that's the thing that shifts the supply curve. When we say change in quantity supplied, we just say there's a movement along the supply curve. On the other hand, when we say change in demand, we say it's a shift of demand curve. Just like supply, when we say change in supply, it's a shift in supply curve. When we say there's a change in demand, there's an actual physical shift of the demand curve. And this happens when one of the non-price determinants of demand, like number of buyers, income, changes. And a change in quantity demand is when there's a movement along the demand curve. So the demand curve hasn't changed, we're just moving along the demand curve. So what does this mean? Let's look at an example to actually try to understand it, and we're going to see what happens. So whenever we want to measure any change, if an event, what's going to happen to price and quantity, we first have to determine what shifts the supply curve, whether that event is going to shift the supply curve or demand curve, or both. Normally we do it one at a time, so we're going to see whether it shifts the supply curve or the demand curve. And then we have to decide which direction does it shift. Does it shift to the left or does it shift to the right? And then we're going to use the diagrams to see how the shift affects price and quantity. So these are the 3 steps that we are going to do to see how equilibrium changes. Now let's look at this assignment where we're going to do this. Let's going to see, all right, so supposing the situation that happened is this. So price of automobiles, or price of gasoline, has been decreasing. Okay, what is going to happen to the market of automobiles? So this is what we want to see. So let's look at an example to see what happens. Okay, so our scenario is, let's make it a little bigger. So price of automobiles, or price of gas, price of gas has been decreasing. Okay, so to see what affects, okay, is demand being affected or supply being affected? So let's list. Now let's see that, okay, what are the factors that affect demand? Okay, so we just list them. Demand, what affects demand? 1 is number of buyers. 2 is the type of product. Sorry. Is it a complex implement or substitute. Okay, let's make this a little bigger. And then number 3 is income. Number 4 is expectations. And number 5 is tastes. All right, what affects supply? Let's listen. Input prices. Technology. Expectations. And number of cells. So these are the factors that affect demand and supply. Now we want to know, okay, what happens? So how do we answer this question? First, let's actually copy the question, and then we can see what happens is what will happen to the market of automobiles. Now from here we want to note, okay, so these are the factors that affect demand and supply, so we listed them. And now we want to see which one is affected. So let's first draw a generic demand and supply curve, and we're going to note from there. So this is my y-axis. Okay. This is the other one. This is my demand curve, and this is my supply curve. Okay. So we should always label the axis. So this is price, and this is quantity. Let's make that okay. So now we have this. Now we want to know, okay, what happens when the price of gas is decreasing? So what is going to happen to the market of automobiles? Okay, so how do we answer this? We initially start here. We have, this is my demand. This is my supply. Okay. So, we know that, all right, well, if price of gas is decreasing, what will happen to, what factor changes? That's what, if price of gas falls, does my taste for cars change? Well, not necessarily. I mean, if I'm driving a car, I'll still drive a car. There's no change in expectation. What will happen in the future? At least we don't know what happens. We don't have any information about income, so we don't know if that has changed or not. But what we know is that gas and cars, they are complements. Why? Because they go together. If you have an automobile, you need gas to run it. So we need to then figure out, all right, if we have that, then one thing we know is gas and cars are complements. The fall in price of gas will cause demand of cars to rise. So if that's the case, then if demand will rise, so this is the observation, okay? What changed? We know that demand is changing. Which way will demand go then? Then the demand curve shifts to the right. Okay. As for now, we're not seeing anything about supply to change. So input price is not changing. Well, because we're studying the automobile market, we're studying cars. So none of the prices that are used that affects the production of cars has changed. The technology to produce cars at least hasn't changed in the short run that we're looking at. Expectations of car sales hasn't really changed. Our number of sellers of cars haven't really changed that we know of. So we know that demand curve shifts to the right, so let's shift the demand curve to the right. And so we shift the demand curve to the right, to the red one. So now, after that happens, so what's going to happen to price and quantity? So we can write that. The old price was, let's say this, and the old quantity is this, okay? So let's label them P0 and Q0. The new prices now here, and the new quantity is here. So the new price and quantity are P1 and Q1. So after all this happened, what we can say is price of cars will increase from P0 to P1, and quantity bought and sold will rise from Q0 to Q1. And this is how we answer the question. So if the price of gas has been decreasing, what will happen to the market of automobiles? Well, we listed the factors affecting demand and the factors affecting supply. We figured out which of the factors is affecting the market of automobiles, and we decided that it's because price of gas is decreasing and automobiles and gas are complements, so it's going to basically affect the market of automobiles because it is a complement to gas. And so when gas prices fall, it's going to cause the demand for cars to rise. Demand shifts to the right. And from the graph, we can see that price then increases and quantity also increases. So this is how we basically answer the question. Now let's say we want to answer the other one. So let's delete all this. Okay, let's also delete all this. So we want to know price of gas has been decreasing. What will happen to the market of, the other question was, electric vehicles. Okay. Question mark next to that. So when we do that, all right, let's do the same thing. We first draw our demand and supply curve. Okay, so we draw that. So we have our price, we have our quantity, and we have our generic demand and supply diagram. We have demand, and we have supply. Okay, let's label them. Demand and supply. So now from here, we can see that, okay, the price of gas is falling. What will happen to the market of electric vehicles? So if I'm in the market to buy cars now, and if price of gas is cheaper, I might buy a regular car. I don't even want to buy a regular car because, still electric vehicles, they're nice. They don't, burn as much fossil fuels, but it's hard to get them charged. It's not that convenient, so it's not that easy to maintain them. So if price of gas is falling, and I may want to buy a regular car and not an electric vehicle. So in this case, if gas and electric vehicles we can consider them to be substitutes. So if we list all these things and we go through them, you will see that, okay, well, gas is a substitute of electric vehicles. So now, if we are thinking that way, then we can say gas and electric vehicles are substitutes. A fall in the the price of gas will lower demand for electric vehicles. So if demand falls, what's going to happen? Demand will shift to the left. Demand will shift to the left. So if demand shifts to the left, what's going to happen? We will shift demand curve and see what happens. If demand shifts, what happens to price? So let's say initial price was, again, we name it, oh, why did that color change? Ah, it's okay. So we have this and this. And we have this and this. So we have, initially, the price was P0. Now it fell to P1. Initially, quantity was Q0, and it fell to Q1. So after demand shifts to the left, we can say price of electric cars will fall from P0 to P1, and quantity bought and sold will fall from Q0 to Q1. And that's how we answer these questions. So same way, if we come up with another scenario, we'll answer it the same way. So at the end of your, if you want more practice, I'll put up some questions at the end of this chapter, and you can try them, and that will help you basically understand what's going on. So the method is just the same. List what the factors affecting demand and supply, and then figure out which one is causing the change. And then just draw it on the graph and see how that affects price and quantity. Okay? Well, hope this helps, and keep on practicing. And then if you have any questions or
I'm going to try to introduce a practical example of consumer surplus and producer surplus to help you understand this concept a little bit better. Often when a company like Nintendo introduces a new product like the Nintendo Wii, they just don't have enough of it. There always seems to be a shortage. There always seems to be a line. And what they're trying to do is capture these ideas of consumer surplus, or they're trying to reduce consumer surplus. Let me explain. Now, in the old supply and demand model, we have an equilibrium price, and consumer surplus is the area above the equilibrium price. Producer surplus is the area below equilibrium price, which means there's people that would be willing to supply at a lower price. But in this market, there's only one supplier. Helps you understand this. Now, what we learn is at these prices, there's people all along this demand curve that are willing to buy this product. Let's say it's Nintendo Wii. So let's say that they have decided they want to do that at that price and that quantity. What they do is they begin to have a supply at a higher price and a lower quantity. So in essence, what they're trying to do is capture all those people that would be paying an above market price for this product. The purple area is the area that shifts from consumer surplus to producer surplus now. And once they capture all this market or these people that would be willing to pay high prices, what they begin to do then is they increase their supply and it becomes at a market level.